Hey everyone, how's it going? I wanted to briefly shine some light on a scene that's been thriving for the past couple of years. A scene that is built upon an era of the Nintendo Game Boy, a portable console released in the late 80s and then came out with later releases like the Pocket Boy and the Game Boy Color. Today I'll be talking a little bit about the Game Boy horror scene that is prominent in itch.io. Developers have been making games using all the limitations of the original Game Boy, with its limited color palettes, sprite sizes, and of course its sound bites, but also offering new stories and new games that further push the limits of what the platform was able to do. And there have been some genuinely impressive projects that I've seen thus far. I'll briefly go over some of them, but beforehand I want to do a quick dive into my own experience with the Game Boy, so to speak. Well, when I was a kid, I didn't really play it that much actually, but it was always around for either me or my brother to play. The console got him hooked on Pokemon Red as well as Gold and Silver when they came out. When he went to school, our mum would train his team for him, so that he could beat the Elite Four later on. It was also a social console at the time, taking it to school and doing link trades or link battles. It was a truly wonderful time for the franchise as well as the Game Boy itself. The console had many other amazing titles too, but it was never really known for horror, or at least we wouldn't see one with a recognizable name. At least until Resident Evil Gaiden came out in 2001. Resident Evil Gaiden was a spin-off title released for the Game Boy Color. It was set on a ship called the Starlight, taken over by BOWs and zombies. You play as Leon and Barry himself, the same character from RE1, the same person that called Jill a sandwich. It had the same core game loop as the classic Resident Evil games, finding keys, solving puzzles, unlocking doors, managing your resources as well as enemies. But its main distinct feature was the timed combat system that it had going for it. It was a decent game that was overshadowed by better titles like Code Veronica, Dead Aim, and the Outbreak Files games. But its sprite work was genuinely amazing for a Game Boy Color game for its time, and for those interested, I would recommend that you give it a try. There was even a port for the original Resident Evil game on here, which never ended up being finished because Capcom had lost confidence in its potential success, and the industry was already moving forward with the 6th generation of console gaming anyways, so it was scrapped altogether. After that, there wasn't really anything else for the Game Boy because of the prominence of the Game Boy Advance as well as the DS and the 3DS, which would be the last portable gaming console from Nintendo, unless you count the Switch. Eventually though, with the rise of itch.io indie development, of fantasy consoles and accessible engines that enable amateur developers to make games without extensive programming knowledge, it sparked interest in the return of game development for the Game Boy of all consoles. In fact, you can download this app called GB Studio and begin developing your very own Game Boy titles, formatting them into GB or GBC files that can run on emulators, and even some of them have physical cartridges that are playable on the console itself. And the best part is, it's a visual scripting engine, which means there's no coding required, at least in the way that you do it in Unity or other engines. The great thing about this engine too is that it faithfully emulates the limits of the Game Boy, the limited color palettes, sprite size, resolution, and sound. It's all here, and some developers have made a ton of Game Boy inspired games using this. Here are a few that I've checked out or have seen, that I think are worth your time. Hellhunt GB is an old school shooter inspired by Doom. You have 3 weapons and 2 different enemy types. There's not a great deal to it, but shooting feels nice here, especially for a Game Boy title, and the sprite work is pretty impressive too. 3 levels which you complete by finding the key, and eventually the exit door. So it's pretty much like Doom in that sense. It's a short and sweet demo that's worth checking out. It's not very difficult and doesn't take that long to beat either. Cryohazard is a point and click adventure game where you wake up in an unfamiliar place, and very quickly you stumble upon some nightmarish creatures that generally just want to kill you. Because of its point-and-click gameplay, you also have decisions that are of a life and death matter. It's pretty short and the monster designs are pretty creepy, but I like the setting and the choices warrant multiple playthroughs. A Possum Country is an interesting one. It's one of those stories where you stumble upon a community that's isolated but with some caveats that have a surprising twist at the end. You play as a pizza delivery driver that stumbles upon a village of people that seem pretty off-putting and unwelcoming. You unravel through the mystery and well, it's pretty interesting to say the least. I won't spoil it however since it's a really short game, and I want to just say here that a lot of these games that I'm going to mention are very short, so I'll be briefly going over them without showing a great deal. However, I will provide links for all of the games in this video so that you can experience them fully. Hey guys, remember this? That's right, PT, the demo that shook the world back in 2014, the Silent Hill game that never was, receiving the Game Boy treatment in a demake fashion. You have the same structured hallway house, as well as all the progression bits during the demo, and the paper bag guy too, and something else in the bathroom. It's incredibly accurate even with the Game Boy graphics, and the sprite work is spot on with the ghost up close as well as the pictures and the bathroom baby. If you want to see a reimagined version of one of the most terrifying experiences in horror gaming history, then I would highly recommend checking out this demake of PT on the Game Boy. The Night That Speaks. It takes the idea of games like Fatal Frame or other ghost hunting games and gives them the middle finger quite literally. You walk through dark rooms with barely any light, all the while uncovering notes as to what is going on as well as pushing off ghostly entities lurking around the corner. The middle finger might make it seem like a joke, but when it comes to confronting fear or the threat of danger, individuals often find unique ways of either coping or facing the problem directly, and sometimes a middle finger is all you need. The sound work here is also fantastic and really adds to the ambience and suspense that this short game provides. It's definitely worth having a look at. Ultimate Evil, which is pretty much just Resident Evil but in a Game Boy fashion. You find keys, you manage your inventory, and you fight off enemies or run away from them. It also adds an FPS camera while giving you tank controls. It's pretty decent, and the story and setting is heavily inspired by the first game. Would recommend giving this a try if that's what you're looking for. Then finally there's De Deus. Out of all of the games that I've mentioned, this one is one of the longest because of the replayability factor given its outcomes and many endings. There are about 11 endings if I recall correctly. Anyway, it begins with you having a nightmare about an entity seeking to destroy the world within 3 days. You wake up and think it's a nightmare, but then you find out that a lot of other kids have had the same dream, and it becomes a big mystery as to what's going on. It takes a similar style plot to Majora's Mask, where you have only a finite amount of time to get to the bottom of things before the worst happens. This is one of the best Game Boy inspired games on this list, and one of the highlights of the Game Boy horror scene. I would highly recommend checking this game out for yourself and seeing what it has to offer. And there are plenty of more Game Boy inspired games like The Third Shift, Soul Void, and Fishing Vacation, which are all quality Game Boy horror games that also add to the goldmine that is modern Game Boy development. And keep in mind too that the modern Game Boy development scene isn't just exclusive to horror gaming. Developers have also been making new Game Boy experiences within other genres, and they have their own pool of games to select from. It's a truly amazing time when old consoles like this are being resurrected by developers that are genuinely passionate about the said device. It's an unofficial legacy that is being upheld by fans and people that still have an appreciation for retro graphics and retro development. Sometimes limits can create the most unique and creative experiences because it generates curiosity to see how far one can go with a limited platform such as the Game Boy. These horror games that I've mentioned have done just that. And gaming is something that has had its triumphs and dark days over the years. But now we live in one of the most interesting periods of gaming, and stuff like this is why it is so. I hope that you have found this subject interesting. I also have plans to touch upon another platform at some point called the Pico 8, which is a fantasy console that is like a retro console but in a digital form, and one that also lets you develop and play other people's games at the same time. Thank you for watching.